Frostbite, Chapter 19. I hate being powerless, and I hate going down without a fight. What had taken place outside in the alley had not been a real fight. If it had, if I could been beaten into submission, well, yeah, maybe I could accept that, maybe. But I had not been beaten. I could barely gotten my hands dirty. Instead, I gone quietly. Once they had us sitting on the floor of the van. They could bound each of our hands behind our back with flex cuffs, strips of plastic that cinched together and held just as well as anything made of metal. After that, we rode in near silence. The men occasionally murmured something to each other, speaking too softly for any of us to hear. Christian or Mia might have been able to understand the words, but they were in no position to communicate anything to the rest of us. Mia looked as terrified as she had out on the street, and while Christian's fear had rapidly given way to his typical naughty anger, even he don't dare act out with guards nearby. I was glad for Christian's self control. I don't doubt any of these men could smack him if he got out of line, and neither I nor the other non boys were in position to stop them. That was what really drove me crazy. The instincts to protect Mora was so deeply ingrained in me that I could not even pass to worry about myself. Christian and Mia were the focus. They were the ones I had to get out of this mess. And how had this mess started? Who were these guys? That was mystery. They were human, but I don't believe for any instant that a group of Dampiers and Mora had been randomly kidnapping victims. We could be targeted for a reason. Our captor made no attempts to blindfold us or conceal our route, which I don't take as a good sign. Did they think we don't know the city well enough to retrace our steps? Or did they figure it does not matter since we could not be leaving wherever they are taking us? All I sensed was that we were driving away from the downtown, off towards a more suburban area. Spokane wasn't dull as I could imagined, unlike where pristine white snow lay in drift. Slushy gray puddles lined the streets and dirty patches dotted the lawns. There were also a lot fewer evergreen trees that I used to. The scarcely leafless Dead trees were seems skeptical by comparison. They only added to the mood of impending doom. After what felt like less than an hour, the van turned down a quiet and we drove up to the very ordinary yet large house. Other houses, identical in the way suburban homes often are, stood nearby, which gave me hope. Maybe we could get some help from the neighbors. We pulled inside the garage, and once the door was back down, the men ushered us into the house. It looked a lot more interesting on the inside. Antique, claw footed sofas and chairs, a large saltwater fish tank, swords crossed over the fireplace. One of those stupid modern art paintings that consisted of a few lines played across the canvas. The part of me that enjoyed destroying things could have liked to study the swords in detail, but the main floor was not our destination. Instead, we were led down the narrow flight of the stairs down to a basement as large as the floor above. Only, unlike the main floor open space, the basement was sectioned off into a series of halls and closed doors. It was like a rat's maze. Our captors lead us through it without hesitation in a small room with a concentrate floor and unpainted drywall. The furniture inside consists of several very uncomfortable looking wooden chairs with slated bags that proved to the convenient place for rebinding our hands. The men seated us in such a way that Mia and Christian sat one side of the room and the rest of us jumpers sat on the other. One guy, the leader, apparently watched carefully as one of his henchmen bound AD's hand with new flax cuffs. These are the ones you especially have to watch, he warned, nodding towards us. They will fight back. His eyes traveled first to Edie's face, then Manson, then mine. The guy and I held each other's gaze for several moments, and I scowled. He looked back over to his associate. Watch her in particular. When we could be in restaurant to his satisfaction, he barked out a few more orders to the others and then left the room, shutting the door loudly behind him. His steps echoed through the house as he walked upstairs. Moments later, silence fell. We sat there, staring at each other. After several minutes, Mia whimpered and started to speak. What are you going to? Shut up, growled one of the men. He took a warning step towards her, blanching. She syringed, but still looked as though she might say something else. I caught her eye and shook my head. She stayed silent, eye wide, and a slight tremble to her lip. There is nothing worse than waiting and not knowing what will happen to you. Your own imagination can be crueler than any captor. Since our guards could not talk to us or tell us what was in store, I imagined all sorts of horrible scenarios. The guns were the obvious threat, and I found myself pondering what a bullet could feel like painful, possibly, and where could they shoot? The heart or the head, quick death. But somewhere else, like stomach, that could be slow and painful. I shuddered at the thought of my life bleeding out of me. Thinking of all the blood put me in the mind of the Badika house, and maybe having our throats slit. These men could have knives as well as guns. Of course, I had to wonder why we were still alive at all. Clearly, they wanted something from us, but what? They could not asking of information and they were human. What could humans want with us? Usually the most we feared from humans was either running into a crazy slayer types or those who wanted to experiment on us. These seemed like neither. So what did they want? Why were we here? Over and over I imagined more awful, gruesome fates. The look on my friends' faces showed I was not the only one who could envious creative tournaments. The smell of sweet and fear filled the room. I lost track of time and was suddenly jolted out of my imagination when footsteps sounded on the stairs. The lead captor stepped into the hall. The rest of the men straightened up, tensioning, crackling around the room. Oh, God, this was it. I realized this was what we could have been waiting for. Yes, sir. I heard the leader say, they are in here, just like you wanted. Finally, I realized the person behind our kidnapping. Panic shot through me. I had to escape. Let us out of here. I yelled, starting at my bindings. Let us out of here, you son of a... I stopped. Something inside me shivered up. My throat went dry. My heart wanted to stop. The guard had returned with a man and a woman I don't recognize. I did, however, recognize that they were Strigoi, real, live well, figuratively speaking, Strigoi. It all sudden clicked together. It was not just the spoken reports that had been true. What we could fear, Strigoi working with the humans had come true. This changed everything. Daylight was not safe anymore. None of us were safe anymore. Worse, I realized these must be the Raut Strigoi, the ones who had attacked the two Morai families with human help. Again, these horrible memories came to me, bodies and blood everywhere. Bile rose in my throat, and I tried to shift my thoughts from the past to the present situation. Not that that was any more reassuring. Mora had pale skin, the kind of skin that blushed and burned easily. But these vampires, their skin was white, chalky, in a way that made it look like the result of a bad makeup job. The pupils of their eyes had a red rings around them, driving home what monster they were. The woman actually reminded me of Natalie, my poor friend whose father had convinced her to turn Strigoi. It took me a few moments to figure out what a resemblance was because they looked nothing alike. This woman was short, probably human, before becoming Strigoi and had brown hair with a bad highlighting job. Then it hit me. This Strigoi was a new one, much as Natalie has been. It had not become obvious until I compared her with the Strigoi man. The Strigoi woman face had a little fine in it, but his was face of death. His face was completely devoid of any sort of warmth or gentle emotion. His expression was cold and calculating, laced with malicious amusement. He was tall as Dremet, and had a slender frame that indicated he could be Morai before changing over. Shoulder length back hair framed his face and stood out against the bright scarlet of his dress shirt. His eyes were so dark and round that without the red ring I could have been almost impossible to tell where Pulip entered and Iris began. One of the guards shoved me hard even though I could be silent. He glanced up at the Strigoi man. You want me to gag her? I suddenly realized I could be hunching into the back of my chair unconsciously, trying to get as far away from him as possible. He realized this too, and a thin, toothless smile crossed his lips. No, he said. His voice was silky and low. I could like to hear what she has to say. He raised an eyebrow at me. Please continue. I swallowed. No, nothing to add? Well, do feel free to pipe up if something else comes to mind. Ishash, exclaimed the woman. Why are you keeping them here? Why have not you just contacted the others? Elena. Irish murmured to her, behave yourself. I'm not going to pass up the chance to enjoy myself with two Moroi and he walked behind my chair and lifted my hair, making me shudder. A moment later, he peed at Manson and ate necks as well. 3 unblooded tampers. He spoke those words with an almost happy sign, and I realized he could be looking for guardian status. Strolling over to me and Christian, Ishak rested a hand on his hips as he studied him. Mia could only met his eyes for an instant before looking away. Christian's fears were palpable, but he managed to return the Strigo's sanity. It made me proud. Look at these eyes, Elena. Elena walked over and stood beside Ashok as he spoke. That pale blue, like eyes, like aquarium. You almost never get that outside of the royal house. Badika, Ozaris, the occasional Zologs. Ozari, said Christian, trying very hard to sound fearless. Ishash titled his head. Really? Surely not. He leaned closer to Christian. But the age is right. And that hair. He smiled. Lucas and Moria's son. Christian said nothing, but the confirmation on his face was obvious. I know your parents, great people, unparalleled. Their death were a shame, but well, I dare say they thought that on themselves. I told them they should not have gone back for you, could have been wasteful to awaken you so young. They claimed they were going to just keep you around and waken you when you were older. I warned them that could be a disaster. But well, he gave a delicate stretch. Awaken was a term that Strigoi used among themselves when they changed over. It sounded like a religious experience. They could not listen, and disaster met them in a different way. Hatred, deep and dark, boiled behind Christian eyes. Ishash smiled again. It is quite touching that you should find your way to me after all this time. Perhaps I can realize their dreams after all. Ishash, said the woman, Irina again. Every word out of her mouth seems like a whine. Call the others. Stop giving me orders. Ishash grabbed her shoulder and shoved her away, except the push knocked her across the room and almost thought the wall. She just barely threw her hand out in time to stop the impact. Strigoi had better reflexive than Dampier's or even Morai. Her lack of grace meant he could completely caught her off guard, and really he could barely touch her. The push had been light, yet it had packed the force of a small car. This further enforced my belief that he was in the other class altogether. Her strength beat hers by magnitudes. She was like a fly he could swift away. Strigoi power increased with age, as well as through the compulsion of consumption, consumption of Moroi blood and to a lesser extent Dampier blood. This guy was not just old, I realized he was ancient and he could drink a lot of blood over the years. Terror filled Elena's features, and I could understand her fear. Strigoi turned against each other all the time. He could have ripped her head off if he wanted. She covered, averting her eyes. I'm sorry, Ishash. Ishash smoothed his shirt, not that it could have been wrinkled. His voice took off on the cold pleasantness he could affected earlier. You clearly have opinions here, Helena, and I welcome you voicing them in the civilized manner. What do you think we should do with these cups? You should that is I think we should just take them now, especially the Moroi. She was clearly working hard not to win again and annoy him. Unless you are not going to throw another dinner party, are you? It is a complete waste. We will have to share. And you know the others won't be grateful. They never are. I'm not making a dinner party out of them. He declared loftily. Dinner party? But I'm not killing them yet either. You're young, Elena. You only think about immediate gratification. When you're as old as me, you won't be so impatient. She rolled her eyes when he was not looking. Turning, he swept his gaze over me, Manson, and Eth. You three, I'm afraid, are going to die. There was no avoiding it. I could like to say I'm sorry, but well, I'm not. Such in the way of the world. You do have a choice in how you die, however, and that will be dictated by your behavior. His eyes lingered on me. I don't really get why everyone seems to be signaling me out as the troublemaker here. Well, maybe I did. Some of you will die more painful than others. I don't need to see Matson and Edie to know their fear mirrored mine. I was pretty sure I even heard Eddie whimper. Ishash abruptly turned on her heels, military style, and faced Mia and Christian. You two, fortunately, have options. Only one of you will die. The other will live on in glorious immortality. I will even be kind enough to take you under my wings until you're a little older. Such in my charity. I could not help. I choked on a laugh. Ishash spun around and started at me. I fell silent and waited for him to throw me across the room like he had Elena, but he did nothing else but stare. It was enough. My heart raced and I felt tears brim in my eyes. My fear shamed me. I wanted to be like Dreamit, maybe even like my mother. After several long agonizing moments, Ishash turned back to the Morai. Now, as I was saying, one of you will be awakened and live forever. But it will not be me who awakens you. You will choose to be awakened willingly. Not likely, said Christian. He paced as much snarky defiance as he could manage into these two words, but it was still obvious to everyone else in the room that he was scared out of his mind. Ha! How I love the Ozida speech, mused Ashish. He glanced at Mia, his red eyes gleaming. She shrank back in fear. But don't let him upstage you, my dear. There is strength in common blood too, and that is how it will be decided. He pointed at us Jampiers and his gaze chilled me all over, and I imagined I could smell the stinky of decay. If you want to live, all you have to do is kill one of these three. He turned back to Morai. That's it, not unpleasant at all. Just tell me one of these gentlemen here you wanted to do it. They will release you. Then you drink from them and or awaken or As one of us, whoever does the first walks free, the other will be dinner for Elena and me. Silence hung in the room. No, said Christian, no way I'm killing one of my friends. I don't care what you do, I will die first. Ishash waved his dismissive hand. Easy to be brave when you're not hungry. Go a few days without any other substances. And yes, these three will start to look very good. And they are. Dampiers are delicious. Some prefer them to Morai, and while I myself have never shared such belief, I can certainly appreciate the variety. Christians called it. Don't believe me? Asked Aishash. Then let me prove it. He walked back over to the side of the room. I realized that he was going to do and spoke without fully thinking things through. Use me. I blurted out. Drink from me. Ishak's smug look flattered for a moment and his eyebrows rose. You're volunteering? I have done it before. Let Morai feed off me. I don't mind. I like it. Leave the rest of them alone. Rose! Exclaimed Manson. I ignored him and looked beseechingly at Ashok. I don't want him to feed off me. The thought made me sick. But I had given blood before, and I could rather him take pence from me before he touched Ed or Manson. I could not read his expression as he sized me up. For half a second I thought he might go for it, but instead he shook his head. No, not you, not Ed. He walked over and stood before Eve. I pulled against my flex cup so hard that they dug painfully into my skin. They don't give. No, leave him alone. What? Snapped Ashosh. Without looking at me, he realized one hand on the side of Eve's face. Eve trembled and had gone so pale. I thought he could faint. I can make this easy or I can make it hurt. Your silence will encourage the former. I wanted to scream, wanted to call Aisha all sort of names and make all sort of threats, but I could not. My eyes flickered around the room, searching for exits, and I had so many times before, but there were none, just blank, bare, white walls. No windows, the one precious door, always guarded. I was helpless, just as helpless I could be from the moment they could pull us into the van. I felt like crying, more from frustration than fear. What kind of guardian could I be if I could not protect my friends? But I stayed quiet, and a look of satisfaction crossed Aisha's face. The fluorescence lighting gave his skin silky grayish hue, emphasizing the dark circles under his eyes. I wanted to punch him. What? He smiled at Eve and held his face so that the two made direct eye contact. Now you won't fight me, will you? As I have mentioned, Lisa was good at compulsion, but she could not have done this in seconds. Eve was smiling. No, I won't fight you. Good, repeated Ashash. And you will give me your neck freely, won't you? Of course, replied Eve, titling his head back. Ashash brought his mouth down and I looked away, trying to focus on the Tarbad carpet instead. I don't want to see this, I heard Eve emit a soft, happy moan. The feeding itself was relatively quiet, not slurring or anything like that. There. I glanced back when I heard Asha speak again. Blood dripped from his lips, and he ran his tongue across them. I could not see the wound on Eve's neck, but I suspected it was bloody and horrible too. Mia and Christian started wide-eyed, both with fear and fascination. Eve gazed off in a happy, drugged haze, high from both the endorphin and the compulsion. Ishash straightened up and smiled at the Mora, licking the last of the blood off his lip. You see? He told them, moving towards the door. It is just that easy.